So first of all, thank you so much for coming on this beautiful autumn day. I really appreciate it. And you're probably wondering why I'm here, and I have a confession to make. I'm here because I'm an anxious mother. 14 years ago, I had a third grader, and he was in elementary school. He was reading, and reading pretty well, but he was struggling with compound words. And I was concerned, and I was really concerned, because I had a deep, dark secret. I was a poor reader in school. And so from the time he was a little kid, probably from the time he was in the womb, I was bathing this child in phonics. And everyone kept saying, oh, when the reading happens, it's magical, it's wonderful, you're gonna love it. And I didn't love it, and he didn't love it, and we had a problem. So I went to my child's teacher, who thought I was crazy, and then I persuaded her that I should really see the reading specialist. And I saw the reading specialist, and she did evaluate him, and she said, you know, I think he might have a little bit of a reading difficulty, but you know, he's a really smart kid, and you don't want that diagnosis. And I, despite having a BA in linguistics and a PhD in education, believed her. And so time went on, and we hit high school, and he hit a wall, and so did we. And so when we finally got the diagnosis, because it comes even for children who are bathed in phonics, we sort of dove all in because we had to. And what we discovered was that as lovely as the teachers were and as helpful as the administrators tried to be, very little was known about this profile and how to accommodate it. And so at first I started to work informally and then professionally as a dyslexia specialist, consultant. Now I do work with kids who have dyslexia and ADD, which is a concomitant issue for these kiddos, and anxiety. So today we are going to start off with these things. The learning profile. You have to know what this learning profile is in order to be able to accommodate it. And I may go on ad nauseum on it, but I promise you it will be ever so helpful. We're going to talk a little bit about the law in dyslexia, and as teachers, how you can play a role. The other role that you play in the classroom in supporting these kiddos, and then the kinds of accommodations that are important and why they are important. But because I'm dyslexic, and because I wonder if some of you also might be, I'm going to start off in a way that really helps dyslexics engage with material, and that's through video. It provides them with a framework to attach information. And the video that I've chosen I really like because it will touch on everything that I'll talk about. But as I said, it also provides a framework, and I think that that can be really helpful.
Dyslexia is clinically referred to as a reading disorder, and it's the inability to read at a level that's consistent with a child's grade or age.
I remember when I used to work with my child, my 9-year-old. I didn't know he was dyslexic, and I would sit there and try and go over reading with him again and again, and he'd always call and I'd wonder, can't you tell that those are two different words? What we know is these are very visual, spatial, conceptual thinkers. So if I was to say the word house, many of you can picture a house. If I say dog, you can picture a dog. If I say the word do you get a picture? And if you're visual, now you have a blank. You have no meaning in what you're reading.
To illustrate the power of connection, let me tell you the story of my first grade teacher, Mrs. Eldridge. I started first grade in Chatham, Massachusetts public school in 1955 at the age of 6. I show up for first grade, I'm supposed to learn how to read. Well, I couldn't do it. The other kids were learning phonics. It didn't come to me. I have what we now call dyslexia, but back then it was called stupid. Well, Mrs. Eldridge, this wonderful old lady, very plump, I can see her so well, she knew there was more to it than being stupid. And she didn't have any formal training in reading, but what did she do? During reading period, we'd be sitting at these little round tables, and she would simply come over when it was my turn to read and sit down next to me. And then she'd put her arm around me. So there'd be her forearm there, my little head here, this enormous cushion right here. And she would hug me into that, and I would feel so safe. And as I would stammer and stutter, none of the other kids would laugh at me because I had the mafia sitting next to me. That arm took out of the process the real disabilities, which are shame and fear and thinking that you're stupid. I was a bad reader throughout the year, but I was connected to the act of reading. And the part of my brain that had talent began to inch its way out. At the end of the year, I was still the worst reader, but I was on my way. I ended up majoring in English at Harvard College while doing pre-med, and that never would have happened had I had a different first grade teacher.
People with dyslexia have a brain that functions slightly differently. And very often, they have a right hemisphere that's very strong. And while that makes it more difficult to read, that may also result in increased creativity and abilities to solve nonverbal sorts of problems. In addition, people with dyslexia often have to work really hard because they're compensating for the fact that they can't read as well. And so that hard work ethic also can often result in people being very successful. So you see people with dyslexia who have been successful in many different areas.
I'd venture a guess that kids spend 60 or 70% of their time trying to avoid failure in most public school classrooms. We need to turn that cycle around. When we can get kids at the point of being successful and help them own that success and take responsibility for being successful, it's a lot easier to think about building success upon success.
So, if we look at this, we can see that teachers really aren't prepared. And the astonishing thing is, dyslexia has been talked about in the literature for a very long time. In 1896, Dr. Pringle Morgan was the first to talk about a child who was developmentally typical, but couldn't read. And he talked of Percy F., saying, I've got the brightest lad in the class, but he cannot read, something's wrong. In the 1930s, you have Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham coming along with their Orton-Gillingham specific and explicit reading program that helps millions of children today learn how to read. And yet, this kind of thing is still not in our elementary schools, helping our struggling readers. In the 2000s, you have structured word inquiry coming in, another research-based program that comes at it from morphology, helping our struggling readers. Still, we don't know about it. And in the late 1990s, Sally Shaywitz from the Dyslexia and Creativity Center at Yale actually shows us with fMRI imaging the difference in the way that neural patterns work among neurotypical readers and dyslexic readers. And still there is very little change. So I am, from the bottom of my heart, so grateful that you're here because I hope that you will be the change because these kiddos, as I'll show you, certainly have great creative minds. They're just waiting for a teacher like Mrs. Eldridge to change a life. So what is dyslexia? You probably heard it this morning, but I'm going to refresh your memory again. It's an inherited trait. According to the National Institute of Health, 20% of the population have dyslexia. Now, dyslexia runs on a continuum. You can have mild dyslexia, you can have moderate dyslexia, severe or profound. It is observed as a structural brain difference. So if you take your hands like this, and you pretend that it's your brain, you see that you've got two sides that are of equal size. This is a dyslexic brain. A neurotypical brain has a right hemisphere that's 10% smaller than the left hemisphere. And they think that that difference in brain structure is what accounts for the difficulties in reading because the different neural pathways that are going to different parts of the brain, from Broca's area to the temporal parietal region, are a little bit different in dyslexics. But it also accounts, they think, for the great brain strengths, which I'll talk about at the very end. It affects language processing. So when I was first becoming familiar with dyslexia, I, of course, like everyone else, thought B's and D's, which is why I was absolutely astonished when in nearly 10th grade, my son came back with a dyslexia diagnosis. It's language processing, so this affects the ability to read, it affects the ability to write, it affects the ability to process word problems in math. It affects a lot more than just B's and D's. It reflects confusion with directions. Now, I was able to sit in on the student panel a little bit, and there was a gal who was talking about directions. She said, gosh, I do this and I just get 2 L's. I don't know which one it is. And that's true, but it's also more than just right and left. If you think of all the language that we use in schools, before, after, that's a direction, and that's really confusing to dyslexics. And finally, it compounds memory weakness. Now, we actually have lots of different kinds of memory. Anything that is sort of encapsulated in a song or an experience, things that you can touch or manipulate, dyslexics are highly able to remember. But anything that is rote or procedural, like the alphabet or your math facts, it's really, really hard for dyslexics. Okay, so it's an inherited trait. You can see that dyslexia falls on these different chromosomes, and they're beginning to investigate where in genes it also falls. There is a neurologist named Norman Geschwin, and he said that it is one of the most highly inheritable traits out there. In fact, he says that it's so inheritable that that's why it's still in our gene pool, okay? If dyslexia were all bad, it wouldn't be here. So there have to be some strengths that are associated with dyslexia. If a child has a parent who's dyslexic, they're 50% likely to also have dyslexia. That's the flip of a coin. If both parents have dyslexia, they're 97% likely to have dyslexia. Okay, so a structural brain difference. We're going to go back to biology or anatomy, I don't know, one of them. So here we have the frontal lobe. This is up here. Then we have the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. This is like kind of around here. And then we have the occipital lobe. This is the back of your brain. So we're going to talk about reading and how the brain reads for a little bit. Okay, so you probably have seen this earlier this morning or somewhere. So this is your typical reader, and this is what happens. So initially, they start off reading by looking at pictures and associating those pictures with the words that are near the picture. So they're actually looking at the shape. And then they begin to link letters to sounds. They realize that cat is C-A-T, looks like cat, okay? Once that's broken down between 4 and 16 times in a neurotypical reader, it becomes stored here in the occipital region. So it's a neural image. And so faster than half a human heartbeat, a child can recall what it sounds like, how it's spelled, and what it means. Now we have our dyslexic reader over here. And notice that there's a whole lot going on in the front of the brain, but not a whole lot going on in the middle and not a whole lot going on in the back. And that's because there is a neural disruption right here in what we call Wernicke's area. So what happens is the phonological module, which is the lowest level of the language system, it's the part that kind of takes in sounds and discriminates them. So ah, eh, ah, and all the other consonants is a little bit sticky. This is a mechanical problem, nothing more. It has nothing to do with their ability to comprehend things. This is a mechanical issue, and it's stuck. So all of the neural pathways are not operating in a neurotypical brain. They're operating in sort of a circuitous manner. It's a functioning system, but it's not automatic. And it requires a ton of work for the reader. So in order for there to be sort of any action going in the back of the brain, a dyslexic reader has to decode a word between 44 and 100 times. That's a lot of work. And it gets harder and harder the higher they get in school. Okay, so the other thing that you need to know, which is really handy if you're a teacher, is that the neural connections, those long axons that are going from the neurons to the different parts of the brain, from the front of the brain to the middle of the brain to the back of the brain that you see in reading, come on, and math, they come on a lot later in the dyslexic population. So this not only affects sort of how they're able to function in school, but it also affects them in their executive functioning, their ability to organize, and it affects them in their socio-emotional interactions with other children. So those areas of the brain that need to be working simultaneously and in coordination come online later for the dyslexic population. And that is really handy to know as a teacher. Why so-and-so is, you know, kind of having a tough time. Those connections aren't there yet. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the learning profile. And I realize that this is a lot of information, but it's really important. So when we were going through testing of our son, he had something called a weak working memory. We had no idea what a working memory was. All we knew is that it was weak and that in order for him to be successful in school, what he needed to do was break things down into little bits of information and go over it again and again and again. So when we went for accommodations, their recommendation was that we take him out of all AP classes and, or we let him fail. You know, that he was going to have to manage this on his own and they weren't going to be able to accommodate him. Well, thankfully we didn't do that. We ended up switching schools and it ended up to be a better experience, but it taught me a lot about working memory. So if you imagine a cutting board and you have 3 or 4 things on that cutting board, if you have a weak working memory, you can only really do things, accomplish a task with just a few things on the cutting board. If you have a larger working memory, you can accomplish a number of things with more pieces of objects to work with. So that working memory is your ability to complete a task with the number of things that you can hold in your mind. Oftentimes, dyslexic kids come with weak working memories. They can't hold that much in their mind when they're trying to do a task. So be mindful of that when you're working with this population. Processing speed. So the processing speed can actually be 1 or 2 or all 3 things. It's the time it takes you to take in information. Once you've taken that information in, it's the time it takes you to actually process it. Okay, what does this mean? And then it's your output. So you could be processing speed challenged in your ability to take in information. You can be challenged in your ability to, once it's come in, what do I do with it? And then to get it out. So those struggling writers that you see are likely processing speed challenged. They might have it in their head, they just can't get it out. Executive function. This is sort of like your airport control center. You know, it tells you sort of which planes are coming in, which planes are going out, who needs to stop, who needs to go, what needs to happen. That's your executive function. It includes organization, it includes memory, it includes the ability to like put on inhibitors. So I'm not going to be focusing on that right now because I need to pay attention to this. Then there's memory overload. So we talked a lot about working memory. Imagine that you're driving in a car and you're driving, you're talking to your kids, you're listening to the radio. You got 3 things going on, okay? And all of a sudden you come into an area where there's construction. This is the quiet while I'm driving because I need to concentrate. That's what that looks like. You've got too much stimuli coming in. You can't effectively be productive unless one of those things is shut off. And then there's the socio-emotional thing. Okay, so for these kids who are dyslexic, this is a biggie. And they talked about it in that video. They talked about the bigger disability being shame. And we're going to review that much later in the presentation. I was listening to a podcast and they talked about LD. And they said LD isn't learning disabled, it's living with doubt. And that really resonated with me because it really is. I mean, these kids are very much aware from an early age that they are different than their abled peers. They know it. As much as the teacher is like, good job, Johnny, you're doing great. They know it, they see it. And it's really, really hard. Then add to the equation an anxious parent, and add to the equation if that anxious parent is paying for a lot of tutoring and support, that kid is even more anxious. Okay, so the important thing here is that if you've met one dyslexic, you've met one dyslexic. I have 3 kids. They're all dyslexic and each of them present differently. So you might have a kid who has mild working memory problems, but profound processing speed. That's my second kid. His processing speed is at the 13th percentile. That really inhibits him from even filling in like little bubbles on the Scantron tests. So just keep in mind, all dyslexics present differently. Okay, so this is talking about the timeline. This is typically what you'll find in the educational system. You're going to find for our dyslexic kids that memory overload appears very early on. They've got letters that they don't understand how to interpret. They have numbers. They're trying to manage the social emotional aspect of being in school. And then they're being asked, when they're still trying to learn to read, to use reading in order to complete a task. That's really, really difficult for them. By the time they get to middle school, they have massive organizational challenges. This is their executive function, unable to sort of perform at the level of their peers. And then they've got more complex writing. I can't tell you how many kids that I work with in middle school who are grammar challenged. They just don't know what to do. It doesn't make sense to them. They're struggling and they're really, really frustrated. By the time they get to high school, the work demands increase. Now they've got to have, in addition to like managing all these different kinds of subjects, they've got to have academic endurance, and they have to be able to think abstractly. They can't even get the information that's in their head out, let alone talk about it in a cohesive manner. So it's really, really difficult for them, and they feel just really terrible about themselves. Okay, so now this is where you guys come in, the law and dyslexia. Congress helped dyslexic and disabled people at 2 different times, with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and with the Individual Disability Education Act, IDEA, in 1990. Now, the first one in 1973 wasn't super robust. It basically just said, we are going to accommodate a learning difference. And that would be like giving a kid extra time if they had a learning difference. By the time 1990 came, this was actually much more robust. Not only did it identify 13 different life skills that qualified, but it also said, look, for kids who can't access the curriculum, even with accommodation, we are going to give them specialized and individualized instruction, and that's what happens with your IEP. So this is basically just a requirement of the 504, and then you have FAPE, which falls under IDEA, and that's basically saying children are entitled to a free and appropriate education. Then you have IDEA, where you have the IEP giving those kiddos specialized and individualized instruction. Okay, so how does one secure accommodations? You can do it in 2 ways. You can be sort of the anxious parent like I was, contacting the school and saying, hey, we're noticing that something is wrong with our kid. School seems to be taking a lot longer for him. There's something wrong. Or as teachers or administrators, you can say, you know what, something isn't working with this kiddo. He is not accessing the curriculum, or she's not accessing the curriculum. We need to test. So you'll have either testing that's done by the school district or testing that's brought in by the parent, and then you'll meet. Oftentimes teachers are asked to be present in those meetings, and then you'll decide, does this child qualify for accommodations? Does this child qualify for an IEP? I think the interesting thing to focus on here is substantially limits a major life activity. Okay, so what does substantially limit mean? This is what's interesting. There is no formula or scale. So it's up to your observations, and that's kind of why I brought you through the learning profile, so you can connect the dots. You don't know what to look for unless someone explains to you what to look for. And you will really be essential to a parent and to a student if you observe something and then can report it. And this is substantially limiting in the sense that compared to the average student at the same age or grade level, this child is unable to sort of access the curriculum. This does not mean the child is able to access his or her potential. That's not what this is talking about. This is about accessing the curriculum. So here's an example. The student is substantially limited if, due to a learning disability, the student's reading takes 50% longer to read a text as the average student in the same grade. Okay, that sounds good. But you can't get inside their heads. You don't know how fast they're reading. So what do? And it dawned on me a couple of weeks ago when I went into the high school to help my child switch his ILP. He was at a private school last year to a 504. He's a freshman in high school. He has it under specific learning disability and written expression and spelling. And the counselor said, well, why does he need extra time for reading? And then I thought, aha, this is what I'm going to put in my presentation. So remember those two models of the brain. You've got the neurotypical reader and you've got the dyslexic reader. Well, spelling is actually a window into how the brain reads. And you as teachers have access to their spelling. So Kelly Sandman Hurley is director of the Dyslexia Training Institute in California. And she says that if you have a spelling challenge, you are 50% illiterate. This is an example of a kiddo that I worked with last year. Now, we're asking them to spell. Notice how many times it takes to spell scuba diving. Notice what's happening. You've got vowel confusion. You've got lots of O's until they get to the U, and then you've got extra vowels in there. They didn't drop the E. This is what's happening in a child's brain. This is how many times, and this is why I put this up there, how many times and the effort it takes to decode something. So you've got faster than half a human heartbeat. You've got 44 to 100 times. That's a big difference. So even though you may not be able to get inside their heads to see how they read, you can look at their spelling, and that's a window. Okay, the other things that you might see is something called the Woodcock-Johnson or the WISC. And these are tests that you will have, that a psychologist would have done on a student. And the thing that I want you to keep in mind here is that you are not looking at the composite. You're looking at the individual categories. If there is a huge discrepancy between, say, PC and sound awareness, something isn't lining up. Oftentimes, when you see these things, you'll see an average, and they'll be like, well, you know, this child is very average. Well, that's akin to like having your hair on fire and sticking your feet in a bucket of water and saying, whoa, I've got a normal body temperature. There's nothing normal about that. Okay, nothing. And that is what you want to be looking for. Now, again, you can't diagnose anything. We know that. But you can certainly point things out and say, wait a minute, like what's going on here? So I'm putting this up here because this is my child, the child that they told to just either fail or drop out of AP classes. So if you look, his verbal comprehension is at the 96th percentile. His working memory is at the 21st percentile. That's a 31% scatter. That's huge, okay? And they were only looking at his full scale IQ at the 63rd percentile. He's fine. Verbal comprehension is your intelligence, okay? They were proposing that he not have access to a field of study that would be interesting to him and potentially life-changing because he had a full-scale IQ of the 63rd percentile. So that's where you can play a role. Okay, now, we're going to talk about connecting the dots. My second son, the one with the small processing, or the slow processing speed, is named Addison. And Addison has a massive case of dysgraphia. For anyone who doesn't know what dysgraphia is, it's your weakness in your fingertips and your finger joints. It makes writing really, really tough. These are the kids that when they're in like 11th grade still look like they're writing like a kindergartner. The tails are going below the lines, the slant is not always sort of lining up straight. There's massive space and gaps between letters. Those are your dysgraphic kids. And so we went to the school and we said, he needs a 504. They said, his grades are too good. So the next year we went back. We said, he needs a 504. They said, his grades are too good. We've asked all the teachers, he scores well, he's a little bit slower than the rest, but he completes it. And then I realized that they didn't know what dysgraphia was, and they didn't know why this is important. So I said, okay, he's got dysgraphia, he's got a weakness in the fingertips, the finger joints. It's really hard for him to do a bubble test. And I know why this is important because I've proctored AP exams when I worked for Portland Public. So when you're filling in those bubble tests, it gets really, really tiring. And if you have dysgraphia, you're going to be slower. So his anatomy and physiology teacher actually gave Scantron tests and observed him filling in those little bubbles. And he was slower than his average classmate or a kid who was his age. And so in March of his senior year of high school, my kid got a 504, and it changed his life because that 504 can go to college with him, and it has. And now he is a very successful material science major at Texas A&M. He's going to be an engineer largely in part because one teacher took the time to look at him filling out a Scantron test and said, you know what, he is slower. They didn't look at his grades. They didn't look at anything else. They looked at what they needed to be looking at. They connected the dots and they made a difference. And we are eternally grateful to that man. Okay, now, not every student with a disability will get a 504. You might have a child with mild dyslexia who has had remediation, who is functioning just fine. Remember, you are looking at how they do with regard to the general population. Okay, and this is just the difference between a 504 plan and an IEP for anyone who wants it. Okay, so I referred to Dr. Sandman Hurley before. A teacher educated about dyslexia can be the one person who saves a child and his or her family from years of frustration and anxiety. So this is the part where I talk about accommodations. I'll talk about formal accommodations and I'll talk about informal accommodations. But what I'd like you to know is that when people have asked successful dyslexics what made the difference in their life, okay, they will often say, the one thing, far above anything else, far above tutoring, far above like my family's socioeconomic level, the one thing that made a difference was an educator believed in me. And for me, that was Mrs. Bogert, my 7th and 8th grade science teacher. She believed in me despite the fact that I couldn't spell and I had a tough time putting anything together, by allowing me to do a science project that was, in effect, project-based learning. I created the digestive system out of construction paper, and I had tubes for like the esophagus. She allowed me to demonstrate my knowledge in a way that was consistent with my profile. And not only did she allow me to do this, but she nominated and I won the science award in 8th grade. I had never won anything, much less something academic related. My family was shocked, and so was I. But that buoyed me to keep going in high school, in college, and on to graduate school. And it buoyed me because Mrs. Bogert didn't forget about me when I graduated from 8th grade. I grew up in a tiny little New England town, and she would see my parents at the library from time to time and always ask, how is Maura doing? What's she up to? And my mother would say, did you know that I ran into Phyllis Bogert at the library? And Phyllis Bogert is asking about you. And that small amount of encouragement via my mom made the difference. Okay, so this is a dyslexic support model by a woman who is well known in the field, Fumiko Heft. She talks about 3 things. I'm only going to talk about accommodations and resilience, but the 3 things that are helpful in terms of allowing a dyslexic child to be successful are proper literacy interventions, accommodations, and resilience. So if we talk about accommodations, that's a lot. I'm not going to go through each one. All I'm going to say is that the big ones would be allowing kids to sort of do something about their poor spelling, because that will always, even with remediation, that will always trip them up to some extent. You want feedback. You want to give feedback often, and you want to help them with their executive functioning. Help keep these kids organized. They'll appreciate it, and their parents will really appreciate it. Pull their parents in. You know, say, hey, Johnny is missing this assignment. You know, this is due here. Give them tips, Quizlet or Brainscape, anything that can keep them sort of engaged and interested. Extra time, absolutely. You will see, and I'll show it to you later, that kids who don't need extra time don't really benefit when they're given it. But for the kids who do have extra time, it's a huge benefit. The kid with poor processing speed, when he finally got extra time, his ACT score went from a 21 to a 32. That's effectively going from the 50th percentile to the 97th. Okay, that doesn't happen in kids for whom extra time is not a problem. Okay, so anyway, you have those. Mnemonics are great. You know, I can still remember, what was it, biology? King Philip came over from Greece stoned. Is that Kingdom Phylum? I don't know, I can't even remember what it is, but I remember the mnemonic. That really helps. Okay. And then with regard to the grading, the one thing that I would highlight is spelling. Make allowances for that. Okay, so these are common services and academic modifications. These are all under your sort of formal modifications. So you have reading and spelling programs that are scientifically based. You have writing programs that are scientifically based, math programs that are scientifically based. And I realize that as teachers, you don't have much control over what you can provide a child. That is really dependent on your school district and the resources that you have, but this is what the research says. With regard to academic modifications, to the extent that you can give these kids a heads up of what's coming down the pike, that's what they really like to see. They feel more comfortable if they have an idea Because keep in mind, they're always living with doubt. They're always feeling like something's going to throw me. I just know it. Their amygdala is like a periscope. Ooh, where's that saber-toothed tiger? Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? I mean, they are just on high alert all the time. To the extent that you can say, hey, in 2 weeks, we're going to have this test. In a week, we're going to have this test. Hey, guess what? In 3 days, we're going to have this test. That really helps them out. Okay. And then with regard to the assistive technology, there's tons out there. The only thing that I would say is try not to make it look like they don't deserve it, because these kids are really worried about sticking out. And if they feel like for some reason it's a crutch or it's an advantage that they don't deserve, it just makes them resist it even more, and they really do need it to be successful. Okay, so here we have Calvin and wait, it's not Calvin and Hobbes. Who is it? It is Calvin and Hobbes. Sorry, my husband makes me put this in because he's a huge Calvin and Hobbes fan. But the important thing is that Calvin is absolutely describing the dyslexic profile. These kids are big picture thinkers, and they're big picture thinkers in a school setting that doesn't always appreciate big picture thinkers. Okay. So, how can you accommodate this big picture thinking style? You can do it by teaching the big picture, like opening up with a video like I did today. Breaking information into small steps, that's really helpful. Pictures, stories, remember they have a high episodic memory. Anything that they can remember as an experience or a song or a video will resonate. It will be sticky for them, which is a good thing. Check for understanding. Now you remember towards the end of the video, Jerome Schultz talks about kids wanting to hide. So the last thing that a child will do is admit that they don't understand something, particularly when it's in a classroom setting. So you might go over and you might say, hey, sweetie, I noticed that, how you doing? You might say, fine, everything's good, fine. So you might say, instead of how are you doing, wow, you know what, it looks like you haven't started. How should we handle this? What should we do? What does the question say? So have them read the question to you to get a sense that you understand where they're at. Do they understand what the question is? What are ways that they can sort of get started? If they truly have trouble getting started, I always use the I do, we do, you do approach, because it really, really helps. And that's I do it for them, I model it, we do it together, and then I have them do it for me. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer. It's not always I do, we do, you do. Sometimes it's I do, I do, we do, we do, we do, and then you do. But that seems to help. And so just check in for understanding in a way that doesn't make them feel shamed. So, okay. And then allow for extra time. Study groups are a great way to help kids, especially this profile, because even though they may be writing challenged and reading challenged, oftentimes they're not very talking challenged. They can talk a lot, and it helps them, if they're in a group of people, feel like they can actually contribute. Give them lots of encouragement and keep their struggles private. There is a man named Gershon Coffin who did a famous shame study on dyslexics. And he said that, he's at Michigan State University, and he said that dyslexics often feel shame on the same scale as people who have engaged in incest. It's huge. It is by far the bigger disability than reading. Okay. So, with regard to helping this population in an informal way, now I don't know how many notes you might have as a teacher, but in the classes that you do, because you probably all teach different grades and different things, but to the extent that you can sort of introduce something with a very strong narrative story, like a video, or get them to watch YouTube videos, or anything that will provide an introduction to what you're going to be talking about, it's great, because it creates that framework that they can tack information as they get it too. The other thing is to create what they call, I think it's a skeleton outline, or where you're creating the main idea, you're writing that for them, and then they have to fill it in, or vice versa, where you've got all the fine detail, the fine little points, and then they put in the main idea. That's really helpful. Okay, now, this is an assignment critique, and I actually think that what's being asked of the kid here is great. It's Hurricane Sandy. It really appeals to boys, big storm, you know, lots of data. The thing that I take issue with is that it looks like this. You had this on one page, and then you had the graph that they were supposed to plot on the other page. Okay, so here we are. We've got working memory challenges. 28 October, 1 p.m., 32.8. Oh wait, was it 28 or 29? Okay, if it's side by side, it's so much easier for them. The second thing is if you look at question number 1. So if we look at question number 1, I counted this up last night. There are like almost 40 words in that very first sentence. Okay, I've got a PhD and I don't even know what they're asking. I'm like, this is just way too much for our dyslexic friends. So to the degree that you can make things simple and concise, that will really, really help them out. But this is also an excellent example of dysgraphia for anyone who wants to see where it is, see what it looks like. You've got the spacing is different. Now this kiddo is almost in high school. The S, the large S in pressure, is taking up like the entire space. The E next to it is so much smaller. That's what it looks like. Okay, distraction-free testing. If you're already giving them extra time, why do they have to have distraction-free testing? Well, this is a profile that actually is drawn to what's happening on the periphery. Okay, they're very much aware of what's going on the periphery. It's consistent with their profile. So if they're taking a test, they may actually really pick up on the sound of the pencil of the person next to them. It takes the brain 90 seconds to recalibrate once it's been disturbed. So it's really important that to the extent that you can give them distraction-free testing, do it. Okay, extended time on tests. Here's the research that shows you that for whom kids that don't need extra time have it, it doesn't make much of a difference. But for the population that does need it, it makes a huge difference. Okay, and then assistive technology. We have all kinds of assistive technology. But again, the idea here is to make it seem as natural as possible. So you might reflect this in your language. Okay, you don't want to make these kids feel like they're getting this unfair advantage. Otherwise, they won't use it. So you could say things like, hey class, I want you to get out your books and your e-readers. Like very casually, very, you know, enthusiastically, make it seem like, you know, we have different learning styles or profiles. It's okay. You can read with your eyes or you can read with your ears. And oftentimes what's good for the dyslexic population is oftentimes good for all populations. So kids might actually enjoy listening to books rather than reading them. Okay, and then finally, keep their struggles private. No spelling tests or spelling bees, no reading out loud, no peer editing. The Beaverton School District, and I'm sorry to highlight them, but that's the only one I know with my kids, they are just super fans of this peer editing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so hard for a dyslexic. And then one teacher said to me, well, what if it was their best friend? And I said, do you know, I still remember when I was 10 that my best friend corrected my grammar in front of everybody. It still hurts me, and I'm 54. Yes, so please keep it private. Okay, so finally, resilience. As teachers, you can play a huge role in helping these kids become resilient. And the reason why resilience is so important is because of the shame. Now, I've told you about the study by Dr. Kaufman at Michigan State. If we think about dyslexia, it really is the perfect storm for shame. So you think about a group of kids who are in preschool and they are crushing it. They are terrific at finger painting. They're great on the playground. And then they go into kindergarten, and what is the first thing that they're assessed on? Yeah, the alphabet, absolutely. And the reason why it's so hard for them is because it comes at a time when they're very young, and it comes without context. They were crushing it on the playground the year before, and yet all of their other friends are getting it, and they don't understand why. And that's really, really hard. Okay, so the antidote to shame is providing them with a cohesive narrative that explains that you learn differently. Your brain is wired differently, and that's okay. Because once they understand and appreciate that they are differently wired, then they can make sense and grow from the trauma that they've experienced by not being able to read very well. Okay. So Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth are researchers. Carol Dweck talks about something called growth mindset. And this is basically the ability to know that your intelligence can grow. There is no cap on your intelligence. And Angela Duckworth talks about grit. I really think that these are mutually reinforcing. The more Mrs. Bogert talked to my mother, the more I believed that I could do it. I might not be doing it in the same timeline as my friends, but I could do it. And so when I had professors that told me I was the slowest penny they had ever met, it was a phonology professor in linguistics. Remember, my phonological module is a little bit compromised. I became gritty, and I said, so what? And I passed the class with honors, and I went on. So these two things are really important, and as teachers you can be a part of that. Finally, this is my favorite part. So we talked about the fact that this is an inherited trait, and it wouldn't be continually passed through the gene pool unless it had some strengths. These are your dyslexic strengths. Dr. Frenette and Brock Eide of the Dyslexic Advantage wrote a book called The Dyslexic Advantage, and they highlight these different strengths. They call them the mind strengths: material reasoning, interconnected, narrative, and dynamic. Material reasoning is basically sort of a heightened sense of 3D spatial ability. These are the people that are able to sort of design things in their head, rotate cubes, create buildings in their mind. So you find that they are very strong in fields like architecture, and actually surgeons have incredible material reasoning strengths. You find them in engineers can have incredible material reasoning strengths. Designers can have incredible material reasoning strengths. Then you have interconnected reasoning. That's the ability to spot patterns. Or negative space reasoning, look at a pattern and see what's not there but should be. Okay, so these are your inventors, as well as some of your engineers. Then you have narrative, and narrative reasoning is a bias towards reasoning about things through experience rather than theories. You'll find your amazing sort of counselors, teachers, even lawyers have an incredible amount of narrative strength. And then dynamic reasoning And this is the ability to sort of predict how things will play out over time. These are your entrepreneurs. Last week I was in England and I met a girl who's studying at the Cass Business School, and I actually know about the Cass Business School because Julie Logan did a famous study in which 40% of entrepreneurs self-identify as dyslexic. Okay, these are some of the kids that I've worked with displaying these various mind strains that I talked about. I want to start with this thing over here. Now, this was done by a child who is 8 years old and went to a summer camp. This isn't a kit. This is something that he created based with materials that were on a table. What's interesting is if you look at it, it's to scale. 8 years old. And it wasn't something that he thought about, he just put it together. This is my son, you know, the one that was told that he should either fail or drop those AP classes. He just graduated from Tulane University, and he's now working in his first job as a strategist for a media company called Hearts and Science. This is a kiddo that I started working with 3 years ago when he was finishing up 5th grade. He was reading at a 1st grade level. Today he reads at grade level. And this person over here turned her passion for performance into public speaking. And she's talking to you today. But I want to end with this girl over here. This girl is a total superstar. I met her about a year ago after a talk that I gave at the Mac Club. Her dad came up to me and said that she was desperate to fix her reading. She had applied to medical school and didn't get in, so she wanted to fix her reading so she could sort of improve her scores. And so I worked with her, and during that time we did help her become more accurate and fluent as a reader. And I helped her sort of, you know, tackle some of those med school essays. So this is what she wrote. Dyslexics can be pigeonholed as stupid, their ideas dismissed over a simple mispronunciation or misspelling. As a dyslexic, I have felt shame, embarrassment, and the need to hide my differences. On the other hand, my diversity has helped me see creative and alternate ways to problem solve. Sharing this insight with my peers in medical school will hopefully give them the same feeling of strength that arises, sometimes unexpectedly, from what makes us different. I'm pleased to say that my former student is now in her 1st year at Creighton University. She's in the top 3rd of her class. She's crushing it. It's still very difficult for her, but she did it. She realized her dream. Now I want to tell you something about medical school, which I didn't know. Typically, med schools get 10,000 applicants. From those applicants, 350 are selected for what they call an interview. From that 350, 150 are selected to be part of their medical school class. This little girl, who didn't get into any medical schools the year before, after talking about her dyslexic strengths, not only got 4 interviews, but she got into 4. Yeah, she's crushing it. Okay. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to find any other disability affecting so many millions of children in the United States today, on which so much research has been done, so many thousands of articles written, and yet which so very little information concerning has reached the average teacher or physician, to say nothing of parents and the public. There is more research done on reading than any other aspect affecting human learning. Only 3% of the population thinks of dyslexia as anything other than a disability. But yet, if we look at sort of the modern world around us, the lights that illuminate this building, Thomas Edison, the cars that brought us here, Henry Ford, and the iPhone, Steve Jobs, Johnny Ives, these things were all made by dyslexia. All of them. You have an incredible opportunity before you. You can change one life. You can change many lives. But you have an opportunity by understanding this profile, accommodating it, and helping these kids enter their zone of brilliance. Because when they do, they are unstoppable. Thank you.